The rain fell in silver sheets across the narrow country road as Ellie Marsden stood beneath the single street lamp, its weak light barely piercing the fog that crept in from the surrounding moors. She checked her watch again. 11:57 p.m. The last bus to Blackfield was scheduled to arrive at midnight, if it arrived at all. The timetable posted at the derelict bus shelter was faded and water-stained, the route number barely legible. 3 days earlier, Ellie's grandmother had passed away, leaving her the sole heir to a cottage she had never seen, in a village she had never visited. At 36, with no job and no prospects in London, the inheritance had seemed like fate. The solicitor's letter had been specific. She must claim the property in person before the week was out, or ownership would revert to, quote, other interested parties. The peculiar phrasing had struck her as odd, but desperation had a way of smoothing over concerns. The journey north had been uneventful until she reached the regional transport hub at Thornwick, where the ticket agent had given her a curious look when she requested passage to Blackfield. Not many go there, miss, he had said, sliding a single ticket across the counter, and fewer come back. Before she could ask what he meant, he had turned to the next customer, leaving her with more questions than answers, and a ticket for the last bus of the night. Now, standing in the rain at the edge of nowhere, those words haunted her. The landscape around her was featureless in the darkness, the downpour reducing visibility to mere meters. In the distance, a cottage glowed with warm light, the only sign of life in the otherwise desolate countryside. Something about that distant beacon should have been comforting, but instead, it filled her with an inexplicable dread, as though it were watching her with illuminated eyes. As midnight approached, Ellie heard it before she saw it. The low rumble of an engine, growing louder as it navigated the winding roads. The sound was wrong somehow, too deep, resonating in frequencies that seemed to vibrate through her bones rather than her ears. Headlights cut through the mist, illuminating the curtain of rain in harsh, unnatural angles. Relief mixed with unease washed over her. The bus was real. It was coming. The vehicle that emerged from the fog was older than she had expected. Its orange paint faded to a sickly amber that reminded her of old teeth. The headlights were yellowed with age and cataracts, and the destination board displayed a jumble of letters and numbers that shifted and rearranged themselves as she tried to read them. The bus wheezed to a stop before her, water cascading from its roof in gleaming rivulets that seemed to flow upward as much as down. The door opened with a pneumatic hiss that seemed to echo across dimensions. Ellie hesitated, peering inside. The interior was dimly lit by fixtures that hummed with an electrical current she could feel in her teeth. The seats were worn but clean, upholstered in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. The driver sat motionless, his face obscured by shadow that seemed to move independently of any light source. "Blackfield?" Ellie asked, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain that now sounded like whispers. The driver nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. His hands rested on the wheel, pale and unnaturally long-fingered, with too many joints. Something about his absolute stillness made her skin prickle, but the alternative was spending the night in the rain with whatever lived in that watching cottage. She climbed aboard, ticket trembling in her hand. "Just the one tonight, Graham," said a voice from the back of the bus. An elderly woman with silver hair and a floral dress sat primly in the rear, a shopping bag on her lap that seemed to writhe with its own life. She smiled at Ellie, a gesture that revealed teeth filed to points. The driver, Graham, made no acknowledgement of the comment. He simply closed the door and engaged the gears with a grinding sound, like breaking bones. The bus lurched forward, continuing its journey into the night that seemed to swallow the road ahead. Ellie made her way down the aisle, noting with growing unease that aside from the elderly woman, there were only 3 other passengers scattered throughout the vehicle. A man in a worn tweed jacket sat by the window, his forehead pressed against the glass, watching the landscape pass by with unblinking focus. His breathing fogged the window, in patterns that looked almost like symbols. Opposite him, a teenage girl with pale blue hair stared at her own reflection in the window, lips moving in silent conversation with something only she could see. Near the middle, a heavy-set man in work clothes dozed, his breathing labored and raspy, each exhale releasing a small cloud of vapor despite the warmth of the bus. None of them looked up as she passed, but she felt their attention like cold fingers trailing across her skin. Ellie chose a seat near the back, not far from the elderly woman who continued to smile her unsettling smile. "First time to Blackfield, dear?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a lilting quality that seemed to come from somewhere other than her throat. "Yes," Ellie replied, trying to keep her tone friendly despite her growing discomfort. "My grandmother lived there. Margaret Marsden. Did you know her?" The woman's smile faltered momentarily, and for just an instant, her face seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. "Everyone knows everyone in Blackfield." She paused, studying Ellie with newfound interest that felt predatory. "Margaret Marsden, you say? The cottage on Wraith Hill?" Ellie nodded. "That's the one. I've inherited it." The bus hit a pothole that felt more like falling through space than striking pavement, causing the lights to flicker. In that brief moment of darkness, Ellie saw the truth. The elderly woman's face split open like a flower, revealing rows of gleaming teeth and something that writhed behind them. When the lights returned, the woman appeared normal again, but her smile had grown wider. "Be careful with inheritances," the woman said, her voice lower now, harmonizing with itself. "Sometimes they come with conditions not written on paper. Sometimes they're written in blood or tears, or the spaces between heartbeats." Before Ellie could respond, the woman turned her attention to a shopping bag, which had begun to emit a soft, keening sound. The conversation was effectively ended, but its echoes seemed to linger in the recycled air of the bus. Unsettled, Ellie looked out the window, but could see nothing beyond her own reflection in the rain-streaked glass. The countryside had given way to complete darkness, as though they were traveling through the void between stars. Time seemed to stretch and compress. Seconds felt like minutes, while entire minutes vanished without trace. The rhythmic swish of the wipers became hypnotic, but their pattern was wrong, moving in sequences that defied mechanical logic. Despite her anxiety, she found her eyelids growing heavy. Just as she was about to drift off, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. The rain no longer fell in a natural pattern. Instead, it seemed to be flowing upward, defying gravity, streaming from the ground to the sky in glistening silver threads that pulsed with their own inner light. She blinked hard, convinced she was seeing things. When she looked again, the rain had returned to normal. But now something else caught her attention, something that made her stomach lurch with primal terror. The reflection of the teenage girl in the window showed not blue hair, but a writhing mass of tentacle-like appendages where her head should have been, each one tipped with an eye that blinked in sequence. Ellie stifled a gasp, turning to look directly at the girl, who appeared perfectly normal under the sickly bus lights. Perfectly normal, except for the way she breathed, which was through gills that opened and closed along her neck. Heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, Ellie turned back to the window. This time, all the reflections were wrong, in ways that violated the basic laws of reality. The sleeping man had too many limbs folded against his body, arranged in a spiral pattern that suggested he was not entirely three-dimensional. The tweed-jacketed man had no face at all, just smooth skin stretched over bone, yet somehow still managed to watch the passing landscape. And the elderly woman's reflection revealed not a human form, but a towering, spindly creature whose joints bent in impossible directions, whose shadow had shadows of its own. As for her own reflection, Ellie was horrified to find it missing entirely. Where she should have been was only the empty seat, as though she did not exist in this mirrored reality, as though she were already dead and simply had not realized it yet. A soft chuckle came from beside her. The elderly woman had moved closer without Ellie noticing, somehow crossing the aisle without standing, without moving, without existing in the space between. "First time seeing the night glass, dear?" she asked, her voice no longer lilting but deep and resonant, speaking in frequencies that bypassed the ears entirely. "It shows things as they truly are, or perhaps as they will be, or as they were before they pretended to be something else. Time moves differently on this route." "What is this?" Ellie whispered, her mouth dry with fear. "Where are we going?" "Why, to Blackfield, of course, just as you requested." The woman's smile widened unnaturally, stretching beyond the confines of her face. "Though some call it by other names. The thin place. The crossing. The door that should not be opened, but always is." The bus slowed, approaching a junction that appeared suddenly out of the darkness, like a stage set dropping from the flies. A signpost loomed, its arms pointing in multiple directions, some of which led up, some down, some in directions that had no names in any human geometry. The words written upon them were in no language Ellie recognized, the letters shifting and rearranging themselves as she tried to read them, forming briefly into words like nowhere, and when, and scream, before dissolving back into alien script. "Driver," she called out, rising from her seat on unsteady legs that felt as though they belonged to someone else. "I think there's been a mistake. I need to get off. I need to get off right now." Graham made no indication that he had heard her. The bus continued its turn, following a road that seemed to spiral inward rather than extend forward, each revolution taking them deeper into something that was not quite geography. The laws of perspective no longer applied. Distant objects grew larger while nearer ones receded, and the horizon curved upward like the inside of a sphere. "You cannot leave the night bus once you have boarded," the tweed-jacketed man said without turning from the window, his voice distant and hollow, as though traveling from very far away through a tunnel made of time. "Not until we reach your stop, and sometimes not even then." "And when is that?" Ellie demanded, panic rising in her throat like bile. "When is my stop?" "When it's your time," the blue-haired girl answered, turning to face Ellie for the first time. Her eyes were not human eyes, but vast pools of swirling darkness, containing pinpricks of light like distant stars being born and dying in accelerated time. "Some passengers ride for years, others, centuries. A few have been with us since the first road was built. They're quite mad now, but they're excellent company." "This isn't happening," Ellie muttered, backing away until she hit the rear wall of the bus. "This is a dream. I fell asleep at the bus stop. I'm hypothermic and hallucinating." "If only it were that simple," the elderly woman said, reaching out to pat Ellie's hand with fingers that were far too cold and had far too many bones. "But your grandmother knew the rules. She rode the night bus for 50 years before finding her way off. Now it's your turn to take her place. The cottage needs a keeper. The door needs a guardian." "I never agreed to this," Ellie's voice cracked. "But you did," the woman countered, her form beginning to blur at the edges, becoming indistinct and multiply-dimensional. "You accepted the inheritance. You signed the papers. You took the ticket. And in Blackfield, inheritance is more than property. It's duty, service, sacrifice. Someone must maintain the cottage on Wraith Hill. Someone must keep the door closed." "What door?" Ellie's voice had risen to a shout, but the sound seemed to be absorbed by the bus itself, as though the vehicle were hungry for human noise. "The one beneath the cottage," the dozing man answered without opening his eyes, though his lips did not move. The voice came from somewhere inside his chest, the one that leads nowhere and everywhere and nowhere again. The one that things are always trying to come through. The one that your grandmother spent 50 years keeping sealed. "Things like us," the blue-haired girl added with a smile that revealed far too many teeth arranged in far too many rows. "Though we're the friendly ones, we only want to help. The things on the other side of the door, they have different intentions." The elderly woman nodded solemnly, her head moving in ways that suggested her neck had more vertebrae than it should. "Your grandmother was a good guardian. She kept the door sealed for half a century. She fed it when it was hungry. She sang to it when it was lonely. She bled for it when it demanded sacrifice. But even the best guardians grow old. They need replacements." "And if I refuse?" Ellie asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken. "Then the door opens," all 4 passengers said in unison, their voices blending into a single, otherworldly tone that seemed to come from the walls of the bus itself. "And what waits behind it will no longer be contained, and the world will remember why doors were invented in the first place." The bus jerked suddenly, not forward or backward, but in a direction that had no name, throwing Ellie back into her seat. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, replaced by a thick fog that pressed against the windows like living cotton, like the breath of something enormous and patient. Through it, she could make out the vague outline of a cottage perched atop a hill, light glowing warmly from its windows, welcoming and terrible. But something was wrong with the transition. The bus had not slowed, had not stopped, yet somehow the cottage was no longer distant but immediate, pressing against the windows, existing in the same space as the vehicle. Reality folded like origami, bringing distant places together without the inconvenience of travel. "Your stop, miss?" Graham spoke, for the first time since they had begun this impossible journey, his voice like gravel being crushed under the weight of centuries. "Wraith Hill Cottage. End of the line, beginning of everything else." The bus doors opened with that same pneumatic hiss, but the sound stretched and distorted, becoming something that might have been laughter or screaming or both. The opening revealed not the road outside, but the front garden of the cottage, complete with overgrown hedges and a pathway made of stones that gleamed with their own inner light. "You have a choice," the elderly woman said, her form beginning to fade like smoke, becoming translucent. "Take up your inheritance and all it entails, or leave the door unguarded. But know this, if you choose the latter, you do more than just Blackfield. Some doors were never meant to be opened. Some doors lead to places that should not exist. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." With that, she faded from sight entirely, as did the other passengers, their forms dissolving into the recycled air of the bus. Even their reflections vanished from the windows, leaving Ellie alone with Graham, whose reflection in the rearview mirror showed not a human face but a writhing mass of colors and shapes that her mind could not process without threatening to break entirely. "Last stop," he said, his voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Everyone off. The night shift is over. The day shift is about to begin." Ellie stood on trembling legs, moved to the door on feet that felt like lead, and stepped through the opening. She found herself standing in the front garden of Wraith Hill Cottage, the night air cool against her skin, the fog swirling around her ankles like curious cats. Behind her, the bus doors closed with finality, and when she turned to look, the vehicle was already fading, becoming translucent, becoming memory. But she could still hear Graham's voice, distant now but carrying clearly through the fog. "See you tomorrow night, miss. Same time, same route." The night bus never misses a scheduled pickup. Then the bus was gone entirely, leaving only empty road and swirling fog and the sound of her own heartbeat, which seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The cottage door swung open of its own accord, revealing a warmly lit interior that seemed to welcome her home. The hallway was exactly as she had imagined it might be. Floral wallpaper, a coat stand holding garments that smelled of lavender and age, a small table bearing an ancient brass key, and a thick envelope in her grandmother's spidery handwriting. As she approached, heart hammering against her ribs, she could make out her name written across the envelope in ink that seemed to shift between black and dark red. With shaking hands, she lifted the letter and began to read. "My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, then you have taken the night bus, and you now understand what your inheritance truly means. I am sorry. I am so terribly sorry that it has come to you, but there was no other way. The door chose you, as it chose me, as it has chosen guardians, for longer than there have been names for time. You will find the cellar door behind the kitchen. Do not open it tonight. Do not open it for many nights. First you must learn. First you must understand. The books are in the study upstairs, written by guardians who came before. Read them all. Learn the words that keep the door closed. Learn the songs that make it sleep. Learn the prices that must be paid. The door is not evil, child. It simply is, like hunger, like thirst, like the need to breathe. It exists, and it wants, and it will never stop wanting. But it can be managed. It can be appeased. I have done so for 50 years, and you will do so for 50 more, and perhaps by then we will have found another way. The night bus will come for you each evening at midnight. You cannot refuse it. You cannot escape it. But you can learn to use it. The other passengers are not your enemies, though they are not your friends either. They are what they are, and they serve their purpose as you will serve yours. In the kitchen, you will find food enough for a week. In the study, knowledge enough for a lifetime. In the cellar, responsibility enough for eternity. I pray you will forgive me for what I have done to you. I pray you will understand that some choices are not choices at all. The key opens the cellar door, but only when it must be opened. You will know when that time comes. The door will tell you. It has been telling me for 50 years, and now it will tell you. Be strong, dear one. Be wise. Be careful. And remember that even in the darkest places, there is still light to be found. Your loving grandmother, Margaret Marsden. Postscript. The thing in the cellar is not the only thing you must guard against. Sometimes, the greatest danger comes from those who would help you abandon your post. The night bus carries many passengers, and not all of them have your best interests at heart. Trust no one completely, not even me. Ellie read the letter 3 times, each reading making the reality of her situation more concrete and more terrible. She was trapped, bound by inheritance and duty, and something far older than law. But as she folded the letter and picked up the brass key, she found herself thinking not about escape, but about responsibility. Somewhere beneath her feet, something stirred at the sound of footsteps on the floor above. It was not an angry stirring, nor a hungry one. It was the stirring of something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time, and was content to wait a little longer. In the distance she could hear the sound of the night bus starting its engine, beginning its route to collect other passengers in other places. And she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was no longer one of those passengers. She was something else now. Something that stayed in one place and kept doors closed and paid prices that could not be counted in any earthly currency. She was home. For weeks after that night, locals would report seeing a young woman with old eyes walking the boundaries of Wraith Hill, carrying an ancient brass key and humming songs in languages that predated human speech. Some claimed that on certain nights, when the fog rolled in thick from the moors, they could hear her voice carried on the wind, not calling for escape, but calling out warnings to travelers, who might be tempted to take shortcuts through places that were not meant for human feet. In the cottage on Wraith Hill, the door beneath the stairs remained closed, the key turned firmly in its lock. And if sometimes strange lights flickered in the cellar windows, or unearthly sounds echoed across the moors, the people of Blackfield pretended not to notice. After all, every village had its secrets, and some doors were better left unopened. But the night bus continued its route through the darkness, collecting new passengers, seeking new guardians for other doors in other places. And on rainy midnights, beneath lonely street lamps across the country, people waited for transportation that would take them not to where they wanted to go, but to where they were destined to be. The night bus was always on time. It never lost a passenger. And it never, ever made a return journey. Unless, of course, you were the guardian. Then it came for you every night at midnight, a reminder of duty, a promise of purpose, a link to others who had made the same choice and would make it again. World without end, door without opening, guardian without rest. Some inheritances, after all, were more than property. Some were callings. Some were destinies. And some, like the cottage on Wraith Hill and the door that lay beneath it, were simply the way things had always been and would always be. For as long as there were doors to be guarded, and guardians brave enough to guard them,